Hello and welcome to Tending to Change. I'm your host, Jenny Juarez. So, this week's episode is all about authenticity. It's a continuation of what I began talking about in the last episode about how our unmet needs and trauma wounds that happen in our early lives can sometimes manifest as addictions later on in adulthood. But this is also a standalone conversation. And it also feels like the perfect time to make crystal clear that as I'm speaking with you in these episodes, I am not coming from a perspective of a mental health professional or an enlightened master or even as someone who has healed all of her shit. I'm coming to you as another student on the path. I'm right here walking alongside you. Maybe I have a bit more experience or knowledge in a particular subject here and there, but I would argue that we each possess the same ocean of innate wisdom and the capacity to access it. I just happen to love to talk about it, and I also have a skill for making certain lofty topics a bit more accessible for those who are less familiar. I choose to record these podcast episodes and share my personal stories as an offering of love to you. Because when you've endured a lot of hardship and pain, especially in your early life, which so many of us have, there's a tendency to feel profoundly alone and stuck. But I'm here to tell you with resolute confidence that you are not alone and you are most definitely not stuck. Life is just hard sometimes, really hard. But we have what it takes to meet it and transform it. We can create positive change in our lives and we can learn to dance with the changes that we can't control. And it wasn't until I started admitting my own pain out loud that I started to discover a vast community of like-minded individuals who were ready to support and encourage me along my own unique path. And it's out of this profound gratitude that I have for them that I choose to turn around and endeavor to offer that same support and encouragement and love to you. I'd also like to take a moment, since this is an episode about authenticity, to acknowledge that my family experienced a shocking and sudden death in the family this week. My uncle, who I called Uncle Chrissy or Unc, died of a sudden heart attack. And so I'm carrying some grief with me today as I record this for you. And I carry that grief in my heart like a dear and tender friend. This death not only brings up my sorrow in recognizing his very complicated and poignant life and the fact that I'm never going to talk to him in the flesh again, but it also brings up heartache because he lived with my mom and my other uncle, and I have chosen to have a low contact relationship with my mother in recent years. This isn't the place to dig into that right now, but I just wanted to say it out loud because I know that there are many, many adult children out there who've also had to make this difficult choice in service to their own mental health or well-being. And it really is just such a painful and difficult decision to make. So again, I'm choosing to lay my vulnerability bare to the world, and it's a love offering and an affirmation that you are not alone in these complex and difficult relationships and the choices that you have to make for yourself or for your family. And if my mother is listening, I just want her to know that regardless of our challenges, I love you so much. And I'm holding you deep in my heart as you walk this path of grief. To lose a sibling is a profound and inarticulable ache that I'm not fluent with in this moment in my life. But I honor you, and I wish you and my Uncle Tim ease of heart and peace of mind in these days and weeks and months to come. Okay, well, if that isn't enough of a primer on an episode about authenticity, I don't know what is. So let's just jump in, shall we? I'd like to start us off with a short thought experiment. I would like you to imagine yourself in a park or a green space somewhere, maybe even sitting next to a body of water. And you're sitting on this park bench gazing at the trees or the flowers or birds flying overhead, or you're watching the stream or the creek or river gently coursing past you. And you become aware that there's people around you walking their dogs, riding bikes, playing with their kids in the playground, and they're all just living their lives. And you're sitting here taking in nature, and so you decide to turn it into a meditation. So you plant your feet on the ground and you rest your hands in your lap. And with your eyes open, you're just observing the natural world around you. Suddenly, in your peripheral vision, you see a couple walking down the path just behind you, and they're just talking amongst each other. So, what do you do? What's your response? What's going on in your mind right now as you imagine them walking closer and closer to you? Do you stay seated and enjoy this beautiful meditation that you're taking part in? Or does your mind start clicking through thoughts of self consciousness? Like, how do I look to these people? Do I look crazy just sitting here staring out in front of me? Do you wonder what they're thinking about you? Or maybe you feel a compulsion to pull your cell phone out or to get up and start moving? Do you start fidgeting with your clothes or your hair? Now, this is not an invitation to judgment, it's just curiosity. Because the truth is, the vast majority of us live our lives with many different masks on at any given moment. We tend to project an image of how we wish we were or how we think we should be, depending on the circumstances and the people we're around. We may be totally different versions of ourselves when we're visiting with our extended family or talking with our sibling or our best friend, or when we're at work or at church. But where does this come from? Well, I would argue that this behavior of masking our authentic selves and feeling very uncomfortable in our skin starts quite early in our lives. And just reflecting on what I talked about in the last podcast episode with Dr. Gabor Mate's work on childhood development and trauma, according to Gabor, attachment and authenticity are both non-negotiable survival needs. We have an innate need to feel seen and heard and valued. We need to feel connected to others in a loving and safe way. Initially, we most need this connection to our parents or our primary caregivers, but especially to our mothers. The mother is the first instinctual source of both sustenance and comfort. But what happens when your authenticity threatens your attachment to your primary caregivers? What happens when your cry as an infant doesn't motivate your mom or dad to pick you up, but instead they put you down in a bed in a room by yourself and leave you to cry until you stop? What happens when you're a toddler and you're jumping and running, laughing, just being your natural self, and your parent or adult tells you, stop acting like that, sit down, be quiet, you're embarrassing me, you're being bad or naughty? What happens when you're a little older and you're frustrated, so you naturally express your anger with stomping or yelling or throwing things, and your caregiver responds by screaming at you or spanking you or hitting you with some object or forcing you into isolation instead of responding to your frustration with curiosity and empathy and co-regulation? If being our authentic self in childhood and adolescence threatens our attachment, we will choose attachment over authenticity almost every time. We learn quickly, whether consciously or not, that we are utterly dependent upon the adults around us for our literal survival. If my parents don't like the way I act when I'm being myself and feeling my very natural human emotions, that becomes an existential threat. I depend on them for food. I depend on them for shelter. I depend on them to keep me safe, to protect me, to clothe me, to take me to school. So if it's a question of authenticity or attachment, I'm going to abandon myself in order to maintain that attachment. And that's very painful because our authenticity is our connection to ourselves. We're authentic when we show up in our lives in alignment with our core values and our natural personality, the me that I am when no one's looking. So when we lose that connection to ourselves, we lose connection to our intuition or our bodily wisdom, which some refer to as our gut instinct. It creates this wound of not good enoughness, like who I am is bad or wrong or flawed. I'm unlovable. And so now I need to project this image of who I think other people want me to be in order for me to feel like I belong. Because if they knew the real me, they would reject me or abandon me. So now I need to wear this mask. We begin to seek outer approval, which coincidentally opens us up to the potential for manipulative or abusive relationships. We may even sabotage our own capacity for joy or success or healthy relationships because there's this part of us that continually whispers that we don't deserve those things. And it can lead us to feeling dissociated, where you're just like a brain in a jar and you're totally disconnected from your body. The body doesn't feel like a safe place to live anymore, and so we stop trusting our own instincts. And then we need to be told what to do and how to do it because we forfeit our personal power to whoever we think of as an authority figure, whether that's a parent, a teacher, or even a religious or political leader. It not only creates a very negative view of the self, but of the world too. We start to view the world as unsafe and unaccepting, and yet we give all of our power to the other outside of us. It's as if we're constantly scanning the outside world for validation and affirmation like, do I have the right to exist? Am I living in an acceptable way? And when we receive praise or status, or even just a couple dozen likes on a social media post, we feel elated. But then if we receive criticism, or worse yet, we're totally ignored, well, we may as well be dead. And it can cause us to really fear our emotions. So here's a bit of a personal story about fearing emotions. As with so many of us, I mean, dare I say all of us, 2020 and the emergence of COVID-19 was impossibly hard. I had just given birth to my third child about 2 weeks before we went into lockdown here in Michigan. And being both asthmatic and postpartum in this very raw, tender space, I was terrified of contracting COVID or of my newborn contracting COVID. So even though I was at a point where I really needed my extended family and my bigger community to come in and support me, my intuition told me that now's the time to respect the social distancing guidelines and maintain strong boundaries about visitors. It was really heartbreaking, and of course, it created some tensions between our little family and our extended family. But there was an interesting secondary thing that was happening too. Having all that space from other people's energies and plans and gatherings, it gave me a lot of time to sit with my own thoughts and emotions. And in that space, a lot of unresolved traumas from my life started cropping up, begging to be attended to. So when I started talking to a couple of my close friends about maybe using our extra time to try writing a book as we had each aspired to do, I thought I was going to sit down and write a book about being brave enough to change our minds and how we live through the lens of my new experience as a homeschool teacher. But what ended up coming out instead was a memoir. And as I began digging into my old journals and my long repressed memories, I started to experience some re traumatization. I became very depressed and distressed, and so I decided to go back into therapy for the first time since I was a young teen coping with the aftermath of my parents' divorce. So into therapy I went. And in that process, I acknowledged that there were a lot of emotions around my childhood that I was afraid of feeling, and in particular, grief and rage. Now, I grew up with a mom who yelled, and she was very good at it. I actually recall telling her on more than one occasion that I would rather she beat me with a belt than scream at me, because when she screamed at me, it hurt me to my soul. But she grew up in a yelling household, and I'm sure my great grandparents yelled too. And when my daughters were little, I was a yelling mom too. I've apologized over and over to them, but yelling is still my most rudimentary of autopilot responses when I'm overstimulated or overwhelmed. So this is like a legacy of yelling. But when you're the child and you are so small and vulnerable, and this adult who's completely emotionally dysregulated in that moment of yelling and screaming, it's terrifying. And you don't get to yell back. So you learn to suppress the behaviors that cause the terrifying reaction in your caregivers. And you also learn to suppress the emotions that you feel in response to their emotional reaction. So again, we abandon ourselves in order to maintain the attachment. So when my daughter gave me a journal for my birthday, I decided that it would be dedicated to me feeling my feelings. On the front inside cover, I even wrote 2021, feel it to heal it. And it took me a long time to write in that journal. Like I was legit afraid of feeling my feelings. For almost a year, it was left blank. And then on New Year's Day of 2022, this is what I wrote. I hate this notebook. I hate it because I committed it as a repository of feelings felt, but feeling my feelings from their emergence to their dissolution terrifies me. it doesn't feel safe. Rather, it feels like a trap set by those on the other side, by those who either have always known safety or who've somehow bridged the impossible divide. In my imagination, this trap casts a weighted net over my body, binding my hands and feet, gagging me into silent submission. What if feeling all the way to the depths breaks me? What if it makes me fall all the way apart and renders me incapable of ever standing again? No, this is not true. This is not my story. Giving up is as much of a choice as persevering. Both are hard, both hurt, both are uncomfortable. But one path is dull, heavy, lonely, inert, and the other contains limitless potentialities. Grace and curiosity beckons me to the path less traveled. You've got this, and I have you. So maybe you resonate to this fear. It's this false belief that told me that if I were to feel the full extent of my grief, of my sadness, of my rage, that I might never come out of those feelings. I was afraid that if I fully gave myself over to them, that either I would destroy something or I would be destroyed. Thankfully, through the wise guidance of some dear friends who are teachers and my therapist, I cultivated the courage to go there. And I can report that, especially if you don't go into those feelings completely alone and without resources, you will come out. It actually reminds me of a quote from author and wisdom teacher Annie Lamott, who said, "My mind is a bad neighborhood that I try not to go into alone." Community and wise guides are crucial at certain junctures of our healing path. And working with long suppressed memories or emotions are definitely examples of places in our minds that are best visited with someone alongside us. I remember when I was taking the mindfulness classes with Carol, and she shared these little lines that she had learned from her teachers, like, "You need to feel it to heal it," or "name it to tame it." And it turns out she was not wrong. Because when we allow ourselves the full experience of an emotion, we'll find that it has a birth, a life, and a death. It does not last forever unless we continue to feed it and stoke it with thoughts, or if we interrupt its cycle by suppressing it. That's when they start to crop up in other problematic ways like addiction or mental illness, or altering our personalities like becoming a people pleaser or a savior or a martyr. And when we fall into these tendencies of emotional repression, while they might be protective in the short term, they eventually outlive their usefulness. We can end up allowing people to transgress our boundaries, or we do things we don't want to do. We might stay in relationships that aren't healthy or choose not to take action on the things that really matter to us. All this to say, reclaiming our authenticity and living from that space is very important. Reconnecting and realigning with our true selves offers us not just profound healing, but profound joy. When we recognize our intrinsic value and worth, and we learn to trust our instincts again, our lives change in beautiful ways. We begin to live our values and in integrity. We delight in our natural personality with all of its quirks and foibles and paradoxes, because we embrace that we're all both and. We all contain shadow and light. And I can't tell you how good it feels when you can walk around and engage in the world and just be you. And you don't have to think about who you're trying to pretend to be at any given moment, because you are just authentically yourself. It's very freeing. But it can also feel a little lonely at first. Authenticity requires courage. You have to be willing to risk people not liking you, people hating you, or not wanting to be around you. You have to risk abandonment or rejection, and these are the very wounds that caused us to abandon ourselves in the first place. So how do we overcome the fear of rejection and abandonment so that we can belong to ourselves again and live in alignment with our highest self? It's not easy work. And as I said before, therapy can be a huge help. Stillness practices of all kinds, but especially anything that brings us back into our bodies, like breath practices, yoga, tai chi, These things connect us to our bodies, which allows us to become observers of ourselves and check in with how we're doing. Like, what are my values? What's important to me? What is my intuition guiding me to do next? So, going back to that thought experiment we started today with, where we imagined we were in a park or even in a restaurant or at the grocery store, like, can you just be there? Can you just notice what your reaction is when you think people are looking at you? Do you feel calm and steady and at ease? Or do you feel fidgety and uncomfortable and worrying about how you look or what other people are thinking about you? Because these are signposts that there's work to be done. So, when we can really befriend ourselves and love ourselves at this deeper level and appreciate ourselves for our exquisite uniqueness, then authenticity isn't so difficult. And here's the irony: learning how to bear witness to your own experience and validate yourself and feel self empowered instead of needing that external validation and approval, you end up living a life that is much more fulfilling and rewarding. You tend to gravitate toward other people who are also living authentically. And the relationships are much richer and much more intimate and vulnerable in the most beautiful way possible. You feel deeply connected to other people and to yourself. And you feel inspired to do the work in the world that you're meant to do. You're willing to live outside the status quo because you're so dedicated to living in alignment with your values and your true self, your interests and your passions and your longings. And I would much rather have that experience than to cram myself into an excruciatingly tight box and make myself small and palatable for other people. And that's why I'm so passionate about sharing my story. Because when I first started this journey, this was not easy for me. It was terrifying. More than anything, my whole life, I just wanted to fit in and feel like I belonged. I wanted to feel loved and appreciated and valued, and I wanted to be seen and heard. That's what we all want. And I realized that the people that I most needed to receive that from, for their own reasons, were not capable of giving it to me. And that was deeply painful to realize and accept. But after my grandma died, life forced me to start being that for myself. Or maybe it's truer to say life gave me the invitation to start being that for myself. And I kept hearing this message to live out loud. And I didn't want to. Like, no, can I just please stay quiet and small and keep to myself? It's safer. But nobody really wants a tombstone that says, "Here lies so and so, safe at last." That's not the legacy I want to leave. Someone who's so risk averse and perpetually terrified of being themselves and taking chances. We're meant to do more than just survive. We're meant to thrive. Life is meant to be a beautiful, messy dance. And so it's no wonder that so many of us pick up these addictions and unhealthy habits because it hurts to not be true to ourselves. There is such a heavy cost to that. And the work seems too hard. But what else is there to do? Now, there's nothing wrong with living a simple life. Simplicity is beautiful. But living a safe life while being disconnected from yourself is torture. So it may seem like I'm hitting hard on some depressing topics like addiction and habit and trauma. And yeah, I am, because that's the exact stuff that we've been avoiding for probably our entire adult lives. And it's what's getting in our way. Because if we want to get to that beauty and exaltation of creative expression and authenticity, then guess what? We've got to learn how to feel these feelings. So that's what we're doing here. Okay, so today I'm going to introduce you to a self-compassion practice because that feels like what we really need in this moment. It's called a self-compassion break, and it was created by Dr. Kristen Neff, who's the author of multiple books on the subject, and in conjunction with her colleague, Dr. Chris Germer, she developed an empirically supported training program called Mindful Self-Compassion and co-founded the nonprofit Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. So taking a comfortable seat in a quiet space, I'd like to invite you to think of a situation in your life that is difficult and is causing you some stress. Please don't pick the most difficult, most stressful thing. Let's start off gently. Maybe it's a phone call that you need to make to set up a doctor appointment. I know that stresses me out. Call the situation to mind and see if you can actually feel the stress and the emotional discomfort in your body. Now say to yourself, this is a moment of suffering. That's the mindfulness piece of self compassion. You could also say something like, this hurts, or ouch, or this is stress. The second component is suffering is a part of life. This is the common humanity aspect of self compassion. Other ways you could say this is, other people feel this way. I'm not alone. We all struggle in our lives. Now put your hands over your heart and feel the warmth of your hands and the gentle touch of your hands on your chest. Or use some other kind of soothing touch that feels right for you, maybe cradling your cheeks with your palms or placing your hands on your belly, and say, may I be kind to myself. Or maybe there's a phrase that speaks to you in your own particular situation, such as, may I give myself the compassion that I need. Or may I learn to accept myself as I am. May I forgive myself. May I be strong. May I be patient. This is a beautiful and simple practice that can be used any time of day, and it will help you to remember to evoke these three aspects of mindful self-compassion when you need it the most: mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness to yourself. So again, placing your hands over your heart or wherever it feels nourishing and comforting, say to yourself, this is a moment of suffering. Suffering is a part of life. May I give myself what I need in this moment. I'm sending you so much love and gratitude and deep appreciation for being on this journey with me. Until we're able to connect again, take care and have a wonderful rest of your day.